Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at something that affects just about everybody on the planet, all 7.8 billion people, and that is work. And we're going to look at the future of work. And in the process, we're also going to take a very strong look at a new publication, the World Employment and Social Outlook, that literally just came off the presses the latter part of January of this year. And of course, there are a lot of recommendations in here and a lot of observations about the future of work. My guest today is an expert in this area. Mr. Matthieu Cognac works for the International Labor Organization, and he is the Senior Multilateral Cooperation Specialist. Matthieu, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into your very interesting study in just a few minutes, but let's talk a little bit about the International Labor Organization. Sure. I know many of our viewers are familiar with it. You just celebrated your 100th anniversary back last year, 2019. What is the main mission of the International Labor Organization?
Well, the International Labor Organization, the ILO in short, is the UN agency that looks after employment issues. It's the oldest UN agency in the UN system. It was created before the rest of the UN back in 1919, first as a part of the League of Nations, and which then later turned into the United Nations. And we're the only survivor of the League of Nations. And it was created at that date, 1919, moment of the Treaty of Versailles, because there was a very strong realization that if we wanted to achieve peace in the world, and that was at the end of the First World War, of course, we needed to focus on jobs, on employment, and really at the core of that on people and their employment. And so that is what led to the creation of the ILO, which still stands today 100 years later. We just, as you mentioned, celebrated last year the 100 years. It was an opportunity to reflect on what happened, on the conventions, the recommendations, the evolution of the world of work. But more than that, it was really an opportunity to start thinking about the next 100 years and where we are going from now. And this is where we stand.
And that's so important. Look in the rearview mirror, but look forward too.
Absolutely.
We've got to determine where we're going. Well, you have many important issues that you're dealing with, and you have 4 core concepts, or pillars, as you call them. Very briefly, what are the 4 pillars in the International Labor Organization?
Well, I think you're referring here to the Decent Work Agenda, which we are following. It's been more than 20 years that we have this agenda at the ILO, and focuses on these 4 fundamental pillars, which are those of employment, creating jobs and good jobs, focusing on jobs because it entices economic growth, as opposed to maybe another logic, which is to focus on growth, thinking that somewhere, somehow, magically, sometimes jobs will follow. It's not always the case, so we have to focus on people and focus on jobs. Another one, the second one, I would say, is a social protection, making sure that everyone has access to what some would refer to as social security, access to health, access to a pension for when you come to old age, or other provisions of social protection that we sometimes take for granted in some countries, but which 70% of the people in the world do not have any access to. That's very important. A third one is on social dialogue, and so this is because we have come to the realization back in 1919 that any decision in the world of work could not be made by governments alone. And in that sense, we are very unique from other UN organizations, because the ILO is the only tripartite agency. And so any decision, any convention that is being considered and is being adopted at the ILO is not only a decision made by governments, but also by workers and by employers. And so at the governing body, 50% of the votes come to governments, and the other 50% go equally to workers' organizations and also employers' organizations. And that's tremendously important. So that's the third pillar. And the fourth pillar of the Decent Work Agenda is on standards, because anything that we do needs to rely on the standard, and this leads to basically the conventions that we have 190 conventions, we have 206 recommendations at the ILO. These labor standards that touch on anything from abolition of child labor, forced labor, discrimination, employment, occupational safety and health. These then, once they are adopted and once they are ratified by the countries, and we have 187 members of the ILO, these conventions then turn into law. And when it turns into law, then it allows concrete actions to take place to actually address these fundamental challenges that happen in the world of work.
And you mentioned about being a tripartite agency, and that's very important to bring the stakeholders, everybody who's involved in it, the employers, the labor, and the governments together at the table, because that way you don't exclude anybody, you bring them in, they're part of the decision-making process, and at the end of the day, hopefully everybody will agree on what they've come up with as the final product.
That is exactly right, and that's as I was saying, this is what makes the ILO really unique in the system, is that any decision comes from this tripartism. This is the very foundation, the core value of the International Labour Organization. It's a decision-making process at the governing body, which comes from governments, workers, and employers.
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. Well, I'm so glad that we got together this week, because this book is still hot. I mean, it's fresh off the press, and it's titled World Employment and Social Outlook. And I mentioned it just came out the latter part of January of 2020. What is the overall thrust of this? What is the big picture? We'll focus in on the different aspects, such as income inequality and that type of thing, as we go through this. But what's the big picture of work? We read articles every day on unemployment, on employment, on emerging industries, on areas of the world that are doing well, others that are not doing well. We talk about the business cycle and what have you. Will we have a recession? Won't have a recession? But how do you see the sort of the macro overview of the world of work right now?
Okay, what this report really points to is the labor underutilization, and that's a very big worry that perhaps we haven't looked at enough in the past. First, it depicts the fact that you have 500 million people, actually to be precise, 472 million people who are underutilized. These are people who are either unemployed, and there's 188 million of them, people who are without work, but they are available and they're also seeking work. These are also people who may have a work, but may not have sufficient, meaning the wages are not sufficient for them. And for that, there is 165 million people in that category. And then finally, you have 120 million people who may have given up all hope of finding a job because they feel like they have gone to the right training. They may have gone to the right internship when they were young, and yet they still cannot find the jobs that they want and they deserve. And many of them, too many unfortunately, have no other choice than to step aside from the labor market. They lose hope, and they are counted in these categories of those who are in the potential labor force. In addition to them, you also have those who have difficulty to access the labor force. So that's a total of almost 500 million people, and it's obviously a very strong source of worry.
It certainly is. And now these statistics that you have with underemployment, unemployment, that type of thing, being out of the labor force, not looking for work, these are, I hate to use the term economically developed and economically developing countries, but I don't know another term to use, but you looked at all of the countries around the world, is that correct? They're from, for example, from Canada, from India, from Ecuador, wherever it might be. So it's from all around the world.
Well, it's actually a very good point that you raised, because if we are to look at only unemployment in developing countries or in developed countries, we have a completely different picture. Mm-hmm. In fact, if we have to remember one thing, is that oftentimes unemployment is just the tip of the iceberg, because in many countries, particularly in the developing world, and I'm thinking here of the least developed countries, the middle income countries, unemployment is only the tip of the iceberg, because what is more severe, what is more at stake here, is the level of informality, the level of working poverty that exists. If I give you an example, a country like Cambodia, if you just look at the figure, you would think that it's going very well employment-wise, because it has less than 1% unemployment rate. And even for the young people, it has just a little bit over 1%. Young people, youth unemployment is very low. And yet, almost 90% of those who have a job are found in the informal sector. So what's really at stake here is not only the creation of jobs. Oftentimes, people don't have any other choice than to work, and that leads them to work in conditions that many could not accept, but yet they have to accept them. And so this means conditions where there's no quality, there are no good working conditions, and so this is where a lot of the efforts need to be put.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about, I hear that term, informal economy, quite often. Is it the same as the gig economy, or is there a distinction between the two? But when we're talking about an informal economy, are these people who are working in areas that we really don't know where they're working, that they have no protection in their areas, they're being underpaid in all probability, maybe or I'm assuming they're making something, maybe a very small amount of pittance, but is that what we're talking about with an informal economy?
Yeah, we are talking about people who are working and yet they don't have a minimum wage. They don't have access to social protection. They don't have access to rights at work. Their rights, and oftentimes they are not themselves aware of what these rights at work are. And so that's what we're talking about. And to make the link with the gig economy that you refer to, there's also a link there. Not that all gig jobs are informal jobs, not at all, but there is clearly a link that is made there, because you can imagine that in the gig economy you may have a lot of workers who are working, and particularly for those digital workers, those who are working online with this technology that allows a young person from Kenya to work for an employer that is based in Germany, for example. And that's all wonderful, that's great. But who's going to make sure that this person actually receives the minimum wage that he needs, that he's protected at work, that there are occupational safety and health measures that are applied, that this person receives a level of social protection if he or she falls ill. So these are some of the concerns that also are very much addressed at the core of the discussion, not only of the informal economy, but of the evolving ways of work, because so many new jobs now are either temporary in nature or they are in those, platform economy and gig economy jobs.
And in your report, do you have recommendations, suggestions on how to help overcome some of these problems that we've been talking about up to this point? Are there recommendations that specifically some countries may want to look at, governments, businesses, labor folks, to see if they can improve the conditions for these workers?
Well, sure. I mean, also this is also linked to the, as you mentioned earlier, we celebrated 100 years of the ILO last year. And so we have the ILO Centenary Declaration that is very much in line with this report, which says that we have to put people first and we have to put jobs first. And so we need to have a human-centered agenda. And to do that, it means that we have to invest in the right capacities of the people. And so this is one of the key recommendations. We need to invest in people's capacities. We need to invest in the right institutions to make sure that our government counterparts, that the employers' organizations, that the workers' organizations are very strong. And that that is absolutely essential. We also need to invest in the right sectors so that we know more or less what sectors are going to lead new jobs in the future. And we know, for example, that those sectors in the green economy, those sectors in the digital sphere, those sectors in healthcare are very promising in terms of the number of jobs that they're going to create. So we need to make sure, and this is one of the recommendations of the report, to put the right incentives to promote that investment in those key sectors. And we also need to work with tax incentive systems so that employers can actually be in a position where it is made a little bit more easy for them to hire and to embrace particularly the entry of those who have more difficulty to access. I'm thinking here particularly of young people or women who are traditionally a little bit left behind and have more difficulties to have access to a decent job.
And this is so very important. And of course, our viewers can go to your website, www.ilo.org, to get more information. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very broad area, but a very important area, and that is the future of work. And my guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Mr. Matthieu Cognac, who is a senior multilateral cooperation specialist with the United Nations International Labor Organization. Matthew, these are major projects. We could spend an hour on each one. They are so important. Let's jump down a little bit and talk in general terms a little bit. What do you see as the future of work as you look into your studies and some of the recommendations? You've interviewed probably thousands of folks around the world and talked to them about what does the future of work look like? Are you factoring in artificial intelligence? What can we expect as we go to 2030 or 2040?
Yeah, well, the future of work, first of all, is not determined. We are making the future of work as we speak. As we are working, you and I and everyone else, we are working so that the future gets designed, and then we have to also see that there is enough support to those policymakers, to those governments, workers and employers organizations to actually put the right policies in place. It's a policy discussion, this discussion on the policy of work, of the future of work. Now, what we're seeing is that, of course, there are some drivers that are taking us in a certain direction for the future of work. One of them is, of course, technology. And the other one is climate change, and the other one is demography. Technology, we see that so many new jobs are now, and I think you were referring earlier to the gig economy. We talked a little bit about the platform economy, are being made online. This is a wonderful opportunity for so many to actually, have the jobs that they want, that they deserve most often, at the condition, of course, that they are well protected. So we need to embrace those new technology jobs. And when by the way, I would like to make a parenthesis. When we talk about this technology job and the digital sphere, and so on, we also tend to associate that with some more negative type of discourse about robots coming to come and steal our jobs. I want to put a little parenthesis on that, because we have to be careful sometimes in what we read or sometimes in what we hear, because robots are not yet, at least, stealing our jobs. We have done a little survey that shows that the most robotized country in the world is Korea, and there you have 388 industrial robots per 10,000 industrial workers. So that's not a very, very high, and yet it is the most industrialized, the most robotized country in the world. And then on the other hand, you have countries like India that have 1 robot per 10,000 industrial workers. And so we have to be careful not to be sending an alarmist or warning message that robots are stealing our jobs, but we also have to say that it is the right opportunity. There is a good window here to work on the right policies for a better preparedness for our policymakers for that event. So that's for the technology side of things. On climate change, we also see a tremendous impact because of the adaptation and mitigation effect of climate change in the world of work. If we say that climate is something that is human-related, and humans spend all of their time at work, or most of the time at work, therefore the world of work is very directly related with this issue of climate change. And so there needs to be a very strong understanding that a lot of the policies at stake here are going to, of course, we will see some jobs disappear, but we'll see many new jobs appear in the adaptation, because the new policies that require the infrastructure, the construction of buildings being made in a certain way, and so on, will actually lead to a great number of new jobs being created. So that's another aspect that I would say falls under this mega driver of climate change. And another one is, of course, population dynamics and demographics, because we talk a lot about youth, and you mentioned, or I think we mentioned earlier, youth employment. It's a big issue. There are today 68 million young people who are without a job, and so we have to think about how this affects the world of work and how we are going to address the right policies in light of this. But when you look at the globe, really, there are 2 regions of the world that are experiencing this youth bulge, and it is South Asia, mainly it's India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. For many parts of the world, besides these 2 regions, you see another phenomenon, which is that of aging societies. And so that's what you see in East Asia, countries like Korea, Japan, but also in most of Europe and the Americas. And so the effect is very different. We need to see how we are going to do with a population that lives longer and healthier lives, that has less people in the active population to compensate for their retirement. And we also have to see how we are going to put the 2 together to create and instill really this intergenerational dialogue. And so population dynamics also lead to migration and a whole range of other issues that are very important.
That's a very interesting point too, because for years we talked about Japan as being a mature society, an aging society. Now we look at the United States. It's moving in the same direction. Some of the European countries are. The birth rate is going down, the fertility rate is going down, and in the United States, since we're sitting here in the U.S., it's very low unemployment at this point, but there's still problems with underemployment, yes. People who have dropped out of the market, as you referenced earlier. But there are also a lot of high-tech jobs that are out there that, according to the employers, they can't find people who are qualified to fill them. How do we overcome that? Will some of those jobs be offshored, or will you have more immigration coming into the country, or what can we do to focus on that particular issue?
No, I think what we have to do is to make sure that we are looking at the creation of jobs that are, satisfactory to the people who have those jobs. And so what we don't want to see is informality repeat itself to the United States or to any other country. And what we don't want to see is conditions at work deteriorating. And so we have to really pay a lot of attention to those conditions at work and to the fact that if we do agree to have a human-centered approach, an agenda that focuses on the people, then we are going to look at the very nature of those jobs. We are going to make sure that all of these issues that we were referring to before, like social protection, that people can access to them, that minimum wage, that it is being respected, that people have access to their minimum wage, and that also that people can work the number of hours that they need to work in a week, because otherwise, like you rightly say, you're going to have a situation of underemployment in the US or in other countries where you will have some people who are hired and yet they are only hired on part-time basis and they don't make sufficiently at the end of the month for themselves and from their families. And so really, I think all this comes down to the need to focus on a much greater attention to the quality of the work that is the essence of, I think, much of the work that we do at the ILO, and also is a very strong question that is being raised, and rightly so, by employers and workers' organizations.
And that is so very critical. One of the conditions or trends, especially in the United States and possibly in other areas of the world, is that we see basically an assault on the formation of labor unions, collective bargaining, that type of thing. And of course, in my opinion anyway, I'm not a professional in this or an expert, but I think the labor unions were critical in helping to raise or create a middle class in the middle socioeconomic group in the United States. And we see that they're under siege in the United States. We see that there's a weakening, a lot of the labor standards and that type of thing, the environmental regulations, banking regulations, and all of that leads to some degree I'm working towards income inequality. It seems that all contributes to this income inequality. How large of a problem is income inequality, and if we don't get a handle on it soon, what could be some of the negative repercussions? Years ago we used to talk about Latin America. It's always South America. Now we talk about the United States as being one of the countries that has a large income inequality. But how important is income inequality?
Well, income inequality is a fundamental challenge. It's one of the key challenges that is highlighted in this report on the World Economic Social Outlook. We are in a situation where the bottom 20% make 4.5% of the total income. We're in a situation where it would take 11 years, that's what it would turn out to be, 11 years for the bottom 20% to make what the top 20% would make in 1 year. And so that is the situation of inequality that we're in. And I'm only talking globally because the numbers are actually much worse or much more concerning if you look at the developing countries, at the developing world. So that's one issue. But this also translates into certain categories of the population. It's very troublesome there. And here we can think about young people, and we can think about gender, and we can also think about rural areas. A lot of inequalities. Young people, they remain 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. Still 68 million young people who are unemployed. 267 million young people who are in the NEET category. The NEET category is those who are not in employment, education, or training. So very big concern. Another source of inequality is for gender. Women have a much harder time to find a job than men do. The percentage of women who are in the labor force is 47%. It's 27 points less than that of men. 74% of men are in the labor force, 47% for women. Needless to say, a lot of efforts must be done, because if we don't capitalize on half of our population, 50% of the women, then we are not going to go further, and it's not going to help not even women, but also societies at large. And also, another source of inequality that happens often that we need to talk a little bit about more is the disparity between rural and urban areas. The fact that there may be a lot of jobs available in rural areas, but yet oftentimes these are not jobs that actually commensurate with the level of income and wages that people need to feed their families at the end of the day.
And there's so many factors that contribute to this. And one you mentioned a minute ago is so important, it's becoming even more important with each passing day, is climate change. We see that there are a lot of migrants, especially if you look, a lot of the folks who leave Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, come to the United States. They are driven out because of the climate. They cannot, their farming has really suffered because of the climatic changes. The weather conditions are different. The soil is not producing, whatever the case might be. But we're going to see more and more of these climate migrants in the future, are we not? And migrating to where they might be able to make a living.
No, that's absolutely true. And so we talked about that at the Climate Summit back in September at the GA here in New York. There is now a new initiative on jobs and climate change that is taking effect. And yes, of course, we are seeing, of course, a lot of displacement, and people are leaving or fleeing sometimes the countries because of climate change. And this means that we need to focus a lot of attention on these people. Particularly, we need to focus on skills training for these people. Skills training, retraining, reskilling. These are some of the core, I would say, key messages when we look at this population of people who actually are in the workforce, or are looking for a job, and of course looking for a decent job.
Well, Matthieu, this report is so important. The World Employment and Social Outlook is an extremely important report. And again, these issues impact everybody on the planet. All 7.8 billion people, if not directly, indirectly, and with people we know. But I want to thank you, Mr. Matthieu Cognac, for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bill. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.